Howdy, Nets fans. Welcome to another season review podcast edition of the Brooklyn Buzz. With me, as always, nothing but Nets. Always the expert, Nick Fay. How are we, mates?
I'm doing great, Jack. How you doing today?
Very well. Had a nice session of basketball in London. It's summertime in the Northern Hemisphere, so I'm making the most of it.
Yeah, Jack's balling out.
Today, Nicholas, we had some players who definitely balled out and had some career years. DeMarre Carroll and Spencer Dinwiddie. Who do you want to kick off with?
Let's go with Dinwiddie.
I like it. Most improved player in that conversation.
Yeah, top three, probably, probably finished third behind Capella and Oladipo. But, both these guys, Carroll and Dinwiddie both had great seasons. But Dinwiddie, similar to Rondé, jumped up in his points per game, jumped up in his assists. Field goal percentage and 3 points percentage dropped, but his role and his responsibility picked up a lot. His consistency was a little bit of an issue, but like we mentioned on a couple shows, some of that had to do with D'Angelo coming back, his role changing a lot. But his on-off, a plus 3.9 rating.
Yeah, he's when we lost Dlo and Jeremy Lin and he sort of ran the team, that's when almost the Nets looked their best. I mean, they didn't probably have as much pace because Dlo sort of likes to sort of slow it down a little bit and is a bit more precise with how he sort of surveys the court a little bit. And obviously in his assists, he's second in assist to turnover ratio in the year. I think only behind Darren Collison. So a huge feat for him, for a guy who was a 38th pick and was a scrub by definition by a lot of people. But, obviously last year there were some glimpses, and this year, yeah, he was just awesome. And I think he was seventh in total assists as well. So, and for a guy who, whose role changed a lot of times with the input of LeVert and D'Lo, that sort of glut that we've talked about in the guard department, Spencer Dinwiddie was one of our shining lights on the season.
Yeah, you can't complain about him. He went from being a G Leaguer to definitely having a role in the NBA. Win shares 5.7, 54th in the NBA, the highest net. And I think that's something impressive just considering on this team. And the expectations for him going to the season was just, essentially to be a bench player. There wasn't an idea about how many minutes he would get with all the guards and stuff. So shout out to him. A really impressive season. He put his basketball IQ on display. You mentioned the assist to turnover ratio, does a great job protecting the ball. Good length at point guard. He has the ability to attack a little bit. He does a good job of taking advantage of bigs in that one-on-one situation. And you just like his ability to run the offense, get people involved.
Yeah, I liked him getting inside, and I like how he ran the team. When he was out there as the lone point guard, the team looked like it flowed really well. And that's saying something, obviously, getting other guys involved, as you mentioned. What was your favorite part of Dinwiddie's season? He had so many dagger threes. He obviously went to it a little bit too much at times, like we mentioned on the Buzz earlier. But some of the times that he hit them, oh boy, they made me scream.
The big three against Cleveland early in the season, I thought that was huge. When D'Angelo was out and everybody thought we'd lose, he played big. Also, that game winner against Detroit, I love because he obviously was fouled and he didn't get the call and he still hit the shot.
Yeah, when we know how Spencer Dinwiddie was probably the most fouled guard who didn't get the call in the NBA, and the last 2-minute report reflects that. So for him, the composure and the intelligence that he has, we talked about on previous buzzes as well, the fact that, he outlined his frustrations to the media, but not in a really sort of, rabbly sort of way, like a guy like maybe a Russell Westbrook would, or guys that don't have that sort of composure, so to speak. Spencer Dinwiddie was very measured in how he, outlined his frustrations and look, we're not getting the calls where it's frustrating, but we've sort of got to play through it. And it's, we don't have that reputation yet, but Spencer Dinwiddie certainly lifted his reputation and then some. The Cavs wanted him. We were going to trade him. There was a rumor for that first round pick of the Cavaliers, their own one, not our old one, which a lot of guys were saying, do we take that? I think he might be in a lot of sort of trade scenarios possibly as well. His stock has increased exponentially more than anyone probably other than Victor Oladipo in this league.
Yeah, they're definitely a huge jump. Like we said, he was I don't want to say a borderline NBA player because us Nets fans watching him last year, we felt like there was a role for him in the NBA. But I think the general NBA realized all right, this guy can ball a little bit. There is still some potential for growth. Obviously, the contract is great this year, under $2 million. And it's going to be a lot of trade scenarios for him because obviously the Nets have D'Angelo Russell, Jeremy Lin still under contract. We talked about Caris LeVert probably being best as a lead guard. His role with the Nets is definitely unsure at this time, but I think there's still a future with the Nets as a possibility. I don't think it's a guarantee he'll get traded. There is some areas in his game where I think he really needs to improve. You mentioned, consistency, very inconsistent. He had 1 month, January, for example, averaged 14.9 points per game. And then in the month of March, he averaged 9.8 points per game. So I think
Yeah.
the consistency, 3-point shot, I think there was months where he was averaging 35% plus, then months where he averaged under 30% from three. So I think just finding the consistency. Do you think, you mentioned the ref thing. Do you think that affected his play at all when he wasn't getting the calls? Because I mean, it's human nature to kind of get a little bit deflated from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And these guys are humans. We assess them like they're these personality, these robots that we expect to do so many things on the court. But these are human beings, and when you're taking emotions into account, sport is a more emotional pastime. Profession than any other. So there was probably an element of that, but I think there was obviously, like we mentioned earlier, probably a bigger effect in the sense of his role changing so much. The consistency he had as that lead sort of guy, I felt like you mentioned with the 14.9 points, the consistency he had as the number one guy, he knew what he was. He was the sort of number one focal point of our offense. And, at points in the defense, he was quite a decent defensive guard. But again, like we mentioned with our other guards, a really big area he can improve on. I think that's probably the bigger point. But like, if you go and say percentages, I'd probably say 70% of it was role change and 30% might have been just the mentality of what was happening to him on the court with the officiating. What do you think if you're giving a percentage to it?
I think I would probably throw in another percentage. I think fatigue.
Yep.
you
Yep.
know, because going from playing, he might have his minutes only jumped, I think, 6 minutes a game. But, in the season, having the ball a lot more in his hands, running the offense, having a lot more responsibilities, and that's giving the ball at the end of the shot clock. And like we mentioned, the role changing, his minutes were definitely higher when D'Angelo was out. So I think just overall, putting those extra minutes on your back, going from playing last year where he didn't play the full season. He was bouncing in and out of the G League back with the Nets, and he was more of a backup role. This year, he had to start at points and really put a lot of the load on his back. So I think that fatigue, I'd probably go 50 for the role change, because I do think there is some question, like intensity wise.
Yeah.
Sometimes you watch Dinwiddie and like it looks like, all right, this dude's about the ball out tonight. Like he's attacking. He doesn't care who's in front of him. He's going to get to the lane. I remember one game against Philly. I want to say this was, I I don't know the exact months, either January, February, or March. In that time period, he was
Yep.
very aggressive, got to the lane. I think he shot like 10 free throws that game. And, you just don't always see that from him. Other games, he was just passing the ball. He didn't feel like attacking. So I would say 50%. Actually, give me, 50% role change, and then 25%, fatigue, and then 25% just overall, intensity kind of lacked at times, some of it doing with the refs.
That's fair. And in terms of one thing in the improvements that Spencer needs to make, obviously that 3-point percentage, he has the ability to space the floor. Like he's got that reputation now, similar to say like Kevin Love shot 1 for 8 the other night, but he automatically spaces the floor because he has that reputation. And Spencer Dinwiddie has proven that. But that number on an entire season needs to get to at least 35% for him to be a more consistent threat, and consistency, across all facets of his game. But I think just off ball sort of, I feel like that's one thing, the coaches, if he is going to be spending an extended amount of time with the team, and I'm sure that Coach Kenny will be asking for this out of him, as will the assistants and Sean Marks. He's going to need to work on his off-ball skills, whether it's cutting. We talked about with other players as well, their ability to cut in the sort of motion offense. Just be a threat there, because he can shoot the three-point ball. And if he can the catch and shoot, it's obviously a much more effective shot than off the dribble. Spencer might say otherwise, obviously, in terms of what he's been able to do. But I'm sure if we looked to the numbers, I think it's the same with Dlo. I feel like, off ball, working, whether he's playing with Dlo or whether the minutes are staggered, he's playing with Caris LeVert, or whether he's playing with Jeremy Lin, because he's the recent news coming out is that he's starting to really ramp up his activity on the court. So we got 4 like decent guards and that have decent potential and decent on-court production. It's going to be, all of them are going to have to work on that off-ball sort of thing, probably other than Dlo, because obviously he's the guy that we're looking forward with.
Yeah, I think D'Lo's probably the one. And he even, he's been decent off ball, but like you said, all the guys can kind of improve. And I think Dinwiddie, like you said, the 3-point shot is very important, especially with all the guards. I think we'd like all the point guards to shoot around over 35%. That's a perfect world, obviously. And you mentioned the combination of Dinwiddie and D'Lo. Last year, that was his worst combination. Him and D'Lo per 100 possessions were minus 10.9. So
Yeah.
obviously there wasn't a great rhythm between those two. And obviously, both being young guards, not used to this role necessarily, trying to work together, it felt like they were just kind of taking turns. Kind of reminded you of like a Russell Westbrook, Kevin Durant thing in OKC back in the day, where one guy was like, all right, I'll run the offense. You just kind of stand in the corner this time. I'll run the offense. You just stand in the corner this time.
Yeah, and I think that comes with just knowledge of each other's games. Obviously, with the amount of injuries that occurred throughout the season, you can't get that chemistry. And obviously, during the season, the Nets obviously being a young team and an improving team, they need those off days to sort of look to the film and look to the coaches and get some good training sessions in. And that can barely happen in an 82 game season when you're flying, coast to coast. And I feel like that's why the Nets, generally started really well and then sort of tapered off, and then they have that big sort of finish because there's that consistency in the lineups, that consistency across the health in general. And I feel like the off season is going to be hugely important in terms of just guys developing their bodies and their health, so to speak, but also just for the team cohesion. And we've seen obviously the guys have been working out together. Spencer Dinwiddie mentions that he loves to go to LA. A lot of the guys are in LA right now as well. So I feel like Spencer's obviously made such a huge improvement with Kevin Durant's shooting coach in the offseason with that three-pointer. I feel like, the number will definitely go up. I'm very intrigued to see what he sort of brings into next season, in terms of the tangibles on court and off court.
If he stays with the Nets next season, what do you think his role will be like?
I like him as a six man, Nick. I really like him as being like I feel like he's in the most improved player conversation right now. But if we have Spencer Dinwiddie for 70 to 80 games next season, I feel like he's a legitimate threat to be a six man of the year contender.
I
What do
think
you
his
think?
defense would pick up a lot. I feel like his defense's intensity on that side of the ball could pick up a lot. Like we mentioned, good length. Like a lot of the Nets, I think he could hit the gym a little bit more. Yeah, like that sixth, seventh man role, it's going to be interesting because I think it's a guarantee that D'Angelo starts. If he doesn't start, that'd be a very interesting move. I think the front office would kind of push for him to start. I would see, I don't know how much they would change the lineup. I mean, Karis LeVert could possibly start or Jeremy Lin. Where do you think, like, who do you, would you, if let's say Jeremy Lin doesn't start, who would you rather have come off the bench first, Lin or Dinwiddie?
It's really hard. Both of those guys have, Jeremy Lin at his best is probably a better player than Spencer Dinwiddie. Do you reckon?
Yeah, I would say he's proven that he can be more consistent, especially off the bench. I mean, I just think back to that Charlotte season with Kemba and him being that, six-man type guy, bringing that energy
Yeah.
and intensity. We haven't seen Dinwiddie in that role, but I think Dinwiddie obviously has a higher potential to be better than Jeremy Lin, especially recovering from injury. It's going to be about how much work can Dinwiddie put in this offseason. Is his three-point shot going to improve? Is he going to accept being in a smaller role? Because part of me has a feeling that, Dinwiddie was great last year and didn't complain about it all. But just the vibes I get from him, I think he wants to see if he can be an NBA starter in this league.
Absolutely, and he's proven that. He's legitimately proven that, and I feel like that mentality is the right mentality to have. But it's also at the same time he has the basketball IQ and the general intelligence in general to be able to go, look, if this is what the team wants of me, then so be it. And I think also that the relationship a lot of these guys have with the coaches in the front office. If Spencer Dinwiddie was to go to Sean Marks and go, look, I've loved my time here. You guys have been absolutely awesome to me, and I think the world of you. But I'd not demand a trade, but if you can find a trade for me that works out well for both parties, then so be it. And I could see that happening, especially if Jeremy Lin stays healthy. But that generally hasn't been the case over the past few years. We're going to have guard injuries, so it's going to be interesting to see. Come that trade deadline in February, whether Spencer Dinwiddie is still going to be in a Brooklyn Nets uniform. If I was to pose to you, gun to your head, now obviously this obviously is a hypothetical, guys. But if I was to go, Spencer Dinwiddie, is he in a Nets uniform come that trade deadline, or is he on a different team?
I love Dinwiddie, but I think he's going to be on another team. I wouldn't be surprised if he's traded in the offseason. I think for the Nets, his value is at the highest point it's going to be because next year he's going to be in a smaller role. He's on a great contract. If the Nets do keep him, then they're just going to lose him for nothing because they're not going to be able to probably afford him and afford some of the other guys because obviously D'Angelo is going to be coming up soon. Karis is going to be coming up soon. Looking Rondé, Jared Allen down the line, and obviously they want some cap flexibility. And having so much money locked up in one position never really works out well. Ask the Portland Trailblazers about that. So I think moving Dinwiddie, I wouldn't be surprised if he's moved on draft night. I think
Yeah.
there's a real possibility. We talked about the Denver scenario. I think teams do not have cap. And when you have a guy like Dinwiddie that can improve your team or just give you a solid bench player, just throwing off random teams in the post postseason that could have used a player like Dinwiddie. You look at a team like OKC. You have
Yeah,
a guy like him off the bench. He's giving you a nice push. I mean, I could see him in San Antonio as just a solid point guard as well. Like, there's really a lot of roles for him in this league, even Cleveland. Like, I mean, he could fit
they
into a
wanted
lot of
him.
teams.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. They wanted him. So,
And he's proven the fact that, like, the teams that Detroit would probably want him back. Chicago would probably want him back. He could fit on 29 other teams in a heartbeat. But another guy, Nicholas, that we've has obviously been thrown into sort of trade discussions as well. Obviously, with his expiring contract, it's certainly a nice sort of asset for other teams too. And his production this season was career defining. DeMarre Carroll, what were your initial thoughts on his season as a whole?
oh, I thought he was supposed to be a salary dump, Jack. No. That, I mean, he couldn't have played better. I mean, I expected him to bounce back because of the relationship with Kenny, but I never expected him to play as well as he did. Some of
No.
that was him having to step up with Lynn being out and some of the guys being banged up. But like you said, career year in points per game, career year in rebounds, career year in free throw attempts, assists. His on-off was 4.2 plus. Win shares 4.1, 108th in the league. I think there's not really much to complain about him. And his overall leadership and the vibe he brought to this team, I think it really helped. And I think if we don't have DeMarre Carroll and you replace him with a player with similar, on-court play, but not the same leadership and off-court play, I think the Nets probably lose five more games.
Yeah, I think easily. The mentorship that he showed to D'Angelo Russell at various points throughout the season, the off-court stuff, to me, is just as important, and that's why the Nets don't have a heap of vet guys that can teach on the court. We have guys that are obviously aging. Timofey Mozgov, Dante Cunningham. Dante Cunningham was great for us, but DeMarre Carroll, to be able to set the example on the court as well. It's huge for younger guys that we have in terms of our building roster with so many of them. Career year, like you mentioned, in so many facets of the game, and he credited that to the coaching stuff and the development stuff. It was just they were the key reason why he was able to. He didn't really miss that many games. 73 games. That's the equal highest that he's played in his career since he was in Atlanta. Obviously, Coach Kenny was back there with him as well. So, I feel like coaching is underrated in this league in so many facets in so many ways and facets. But for DeMarre Carroll, he knows how important it was for him, and it truly showed throughout those 73 games.
Yeah, and you mentioned the coaching and development team. Also, he shouted out the performance team multiple times, saying he had that one knee injury where it looked like he might have been seriously hurt. And he said if he hadn't worked with the Nets performance team, he probably would have been out a couple of weeks. So shout out to them for doing a great job. And I think he just set the example how to play the right way. All-around player. He knows how Kenny wanted to be played on the court. Basketball IQ was definitely there. He showed guys he told guys, where they need to be, what they need to do to be successful in this league. And like you said, D'Angelo, I thought that relationship was huge. And he's probably going to, even when he leaves, his impact is still going to be felt in Brooklyn for the culture he's helped set. He was a big piece in helping the Nets change that vibe, especially this last season.
Absolutely, and I feel like a lot of teams are going to be clamoring for him in the sense of they're looking at his salary dump, so to speak, and his just production in general. So many guys are looking for those wings. You go to New Orleans, you could even go to Houston. There are so many teams that are wanting a productive wing that can defend and shoot a 3-point shot. And DeMarre Carroll does that perfectly. You could rival that with Trevor Ariza. DeMarre Carroll, though, is only improving, whereas you look at Trevor Ariza right now, he's certainly on the downswing in terms of his age. Now, I'm not saying that DeMarre Carroll doesn't have age on his legs as well. He's 31 years old and going into his age 32 season. But, the fact that he was able to have a career year in his 31st year, it's LeBron light, so to speak. So it just shows that, you can never stop improving. And I feel like, there's so many players on this roster that we mentioned in our player season reviews that have done that and age despite.
I think age 31, bouncing back, especially for the injuries. Everybody thought he was done in Toronto. People still think he's done because they haven't watched the Nets last season. But like you said, all around complimentary player. I think the only thing you really could hate on him for is the 41% from the field. Some of that's just having to force shots because the Nets couldn't, get good possessions every offensive time down the floor. He also did a great job of getting to the free throw line a couple times. He had that one move where he just kind of drive and then put his arms in and kind of just draw the foul. And it seemed like he always got free throws at a time when the Nets really needed it. But Jack, who's more likely to be traded for you, DeMarre Carroll or Spencer Dinwiddie?
That's a really tough one, Nick. Now, if you're looking at the roster composition as a whole, you'd say Spencer Dinwiddie with the amount of guards that we have, and obviously DeMarre. He's not the value both of these guys have right now is at its peak. DeMarre can still have a great year next year, but at the same time, you look at the contract as well. Want to get that off, get another young asset possibly. I feel like DeMarre is such an important part of this locker room that I feel like Dinwiddie is more likely to be traded. Now, Dinwiddie obviously has been a huge part of the leadership that he showed on the court, especially in that key stretch in the middle of the season when we were having injuries at left, right, and center. So I would probably lean towards Dinwiddie being traded, but at the same time, it certainly could be both. What do you think?
I agree. I think Dinwiddie's more likely to be traded, like you mentioned. Overall roster construction, I think you could also see Carroll more at the 4 this year. I know he doesn't necessarily enjoy that, but while the guards, here to play, and then obviously Joe Harris and Allen Crabbe needs to get minutes, I think it'd be more likely for Carroll to not be traded. And I think the Nets like to keep his leadership around, because I would assume that there was a deal out there to grab another first-round pick for DeMarre at the trade deadline last year, and they just didn't take it because it wasn't high enough. And I think they like having him around. And Dinwiddie, his contract is just so movable. So many teams that are cap strapped could actually make a move for Dinwiddie, where Carroll's still, I think, making around $14 million a year, even though it is expiring. It's still, you got to move contracts and make it work, where I think Dinwiddie's it's almost an ideal trade piece.
Absolutely, yeah. There's so many things that you have to take into account when making a trade. Now, obviously, with DeMarre Carroll with 14 million, you have to find other guys that are worth that money and sort of make up the difference in that sense. Obviously, the Nets have a little bit of salary cap space, but not a huge amount to sort of afford a max guy in the sense of maybe a borderline max guy. So I feel like yes, DeMarre Carroll, they're both probably going to be traded. I'll be surprised if they're not. But at the same time, DeMarre and Spencer both have huge impacts on this team, and I can see them not being traded at the same time. It's going to be a fascinating offseason for many teams, and including our Brooklyn Nets. But in terms of what is the lowest, you were mentioning that pick before, Nick, that was probably offered to both Spencer and DeMarre Carroll in sort of trade scenarios that we've talked about, in other player season reviews and in other pods. What is the lowest that you would sort of take? What's the ideal sort of scenario that you're taking back? Is it a young developing guy like a Malik Beasley from Denver? Is it a pick? Is it a combination of both? Is it maybe another sort of leader who's on a sort of lower contract? Guys have been mentioning Ryan Anderson as well in terms of his fit, and it's yuck in terms of obviously that contract as well. And I can't see the Nets making that unless Houston gives us a billion first-round picks. So there's just so many different scenarios that could sort of happen with the Nets. What's for you? You're Sean Marks, and you're making the calls. What do you want to do with these two?
I mean, if we're talking Ryan Anderson, I'm not taking him without 2 first-round picks. There's not even young players on Houston's roster really that you can throw in a trade. So Ryan Anderson, that's that. It's tough. Like you mentioned, Dinwiddie possibly asking to be traded. I wouldn't be 100% surprised by that. I think, you want something probably over 25, but, you can't really get maybe to that 20 to 25 range, or you have to throw in another asset yourself. Maybe we talked about throwing in the 29 pick and Dinwiddie to try to move up or something like that, throwing in some second-round picks, maybe throwing in a future pick. It's very tough. Carroll, on the other hand, I don't know if it's going to be harder to trade him, I think, now than it was last year because of the people being cap strapped and him being expiring. I think there's a scenario where he stays with the Nets this season. He ends up in the offseason. They re-sign him on a really favorable deal, and they kind of work him into more of a bench role, and they kind of keep him long-term. They give him some decent money, but they overpay him a touch just because they want that leadership around and that culture. So I think both those guys, it would have to be, you're not going to trade him for nothing unless Dinwiddie's asking to be traded. We know Carroll doesn't really want to be traded. He's happy in Brooklyn. He's happy with Kenny. He loves the performance team. So I think the Carroll trade, someone's going to have to offer you a good deal for Carroll. Someone's going to have to be like, all right, I want, I'm going to send you this, and Sean Marks isn't going to be able to turn it down. If that's, a decent first-round pick, is that a young player? It's very tough. Could it be in like some type of sign-in trade? I'm not really sure. Dinwiddie, on the other hand, I think they're more so willing to take a trade that might be a little bit undervalued just because they know they're not going to be able to keep him, and there is some question marks about will they have playing time for all these guards, especially for, with Jeremy Lin. Like, I think Jeremy Lin is a big X factor, and they're going to look at his health a lot going to the draft, going to the offseason, where he's at. Can he really contribute at a high level next year?
Yeah, there's so many questions for this Nets team, and some of them are good questions, some of them are certainly bad questions in terms of, some of these guys might get hurt, some of these guys might get traded, fan favorites, so to speak. But yeah, I feel like, the DeMarre Carroll, he was touted, for Detroit and New Orleans. Those two shooters are probably still out there, but in terms of like what's the equivalent trade going to be, I don't think New Orleans will want him anymore, obviously, after getting Nikola Mirotic. But you look at what the sort of Bulls did in that trade. They took on Omar Asik's contract, which I think is only 1 or 2 more years, and then they got a first rounder out of it to get rid of Nikola Mirotic, who was leaving, nonetheless. So there's certainly, comparable scenarios that I'm sure would happen for DeMarre Carroll and or Spencer Dinwiddie. It's going to be interesting to see the future of these two guys and, how Sean Marks works his magic, as we've so often marveled at. But guys, thank you for tuning in always. Nick, it's always a pleasure. Make sure you guys, I forgot to mention, subscribing on iTunes, following on Blog Talk Radio, hitting up at OTG Basketball. The finals coverage is going absolutely wild there right now. And obviously there's a nice little giveaway as well that Nick's been tweeting out, as well as on the OTG page. So follow it all. And guys, thanks again. Nicholas, as always, it's been a pleasure.
Same here, Jack. Pleasure to always record with you. And also check out OTG Basketball. Jack's been dropping some great pieces. Karis LeVert season review, Rondé Hollis Jefferson season review. If you want to, read the article while you listen to the pod, that's good too.
Absolutely. Cheers, mate.